I was 10 when my mom rented the gray house with the low crawl space. The lot sat at the end of a quiet street. Pines bent over the roof, the porch sagged, the rent fit our budget. That was the win. The first night, the heat kicked on. The vents thumped. A rush of warm air filled my room. I liked that sound. It meant the house still worked. Then a new sound came through the return in the hall. It sounded like breath, long in and long out. I stood under the grill and felt the pull. I told myself the fan made that breath. The fan moved air. Fans do that. By the second week I heard words. They hid inside the fan noise. I pressed my ear to the metal. The words shaped my name. I stepped back and looked down the hall. No one stood there. My mom snored in her room. My sister slept with her arm thrown over her face. I wrote it off. The next day I asked the landlord about the HVAC. He said the furnace was new. Said a tech had swapped the blower and sealed the plenum. He said the previous owner had wired an intercom in the 70s. He left it in the crawl space. It never worked. That night, I turned the thermostat to heat. The blower kicked on. The vent in my room rattled and hissed. Then I heard my name again. The voice sat right behind the metal, spoke in a low rasp. It asked if I could hear it. It said, "Say yes." I turned off the wall switch. The fan died, the voice faded. I stared at the grill. I did not sleep much. The morning I pulled the register with a butter knife. Dust fell in soft clumps. Marble and a penny sat in the throat of the duct. I reached in and felt cold sheet metal. The duct turned. It ran down into the floor. I could not reach more. After school, I got my old tape recorder. It was a microcassette from a garage sale. I set it by the hall return and pressed record. I let the furnace run for an hour. I rewound, hit play. The fan roared. I heard my name. I heard a new line. The voice said, "I live under." Then the tape clicked. Then the hiss returned. Then the voice said, "Open the hatch." I stood over the crawl space door at noon. The hatch sat in the hall closet. 4 wood screws held it in place. The landlord did not want us in there. I told myself I would not break rules. I closed the closet and walked away. At dusk, the hall smelled like damp dirt. The smell flowed out from that closet and into the kitchen. I ate, with a knot in my gut. At 2 in the morning, I woke to a strong pull on the air. The fan on the furnace had shut off. The thermostat sat at 65, yet air still moved through the grills. It drew in like the house breathed on its own. Mom slept through it. My sister whimpered in her room. I stood and walked to the hall. The closet door stood open. The hatch sat loose on the frame. The screws lay in a neat row. I did not touch a thing. The voice came again. It rose from the dark square. It used my mom's tone. It said my name the way she did when I broke a rule. It said, "Come here." I could not breathe, could not move my feet. The voice changed. Now it used my own voice. It said, "I am down here." That broke the spell. I ran to my room and slammed the door. I shoved a chair under the knob. I watched the gap under the door. Air pressed at that gap. Dust moved. Fine dust slid toward me like ash. In the morning, I told my mom the hatch was open. She frowned and said, "The landlord must have been here." She said he should have called. We checked. No note. No text. The hatch sat closed now. Screws had returned to the wood. We stared at the neat heads. She said maybe I dreamed it. She said I needed rest. The next week brought rain. Cold air dropped into the ducts. The voice grew bold. It spoke when the fan sat off. It spoke when we ate dinner. It spoke in the bathroom through the floor register. It told me it could move inside the metal. It could ride the vents. It could be in any room. I placed the recorder in my sister's room. I told her I wanted a school project. She did not ask more. At midnight, she woke and said I sat on her bed. I had not. I lay there in my own room with my eyes on the vent. In the morning, I played the tape. My sister's breath filled the first minute. Then the fan started, and my own voice washed through the tiny speaker. I heard my tone. I heard my words. The voice said, "Scoot over." My sister screamed and threw the recorder. The tape spilled. We picked it up in shock. We did not tell Mom. We did not want more yelling. 2 days later, the furnace stopped. The breaker tripped. The blower died. The house grew cold. We called the landlord. He said he could come on Saturday. We used space heaters that night. The vents went quiet. Felt peace for 1 hour. Then the return in the hall began to hum. Not heat, not fan. A tone like a throat that cleared. The hatch in the closet lifted an inch. Warm breath rolled out. Smelled like the inside of a grave. I pulled my sister into the car and waited there with the dome light on. We watched the door. We saw the porch beam flex. My mom came home late from a double shift, saw our faces and went to the closet with a hammer. She nailed the hatch shut, 6 nails. Then she pushed a dresser over it. She lit a candle and said a prayer. She stood there until the wick burned out. We moved 1 month later. The landlord fought us on the deposit, said we scratched the floor by the hall, said it looked like claw marks. He said we forced the closet door, said someone pulled old wire out of the crawl space and left it by the return, sent a photo. It showed a square speaker with a cone of brown paper and 2 frayed leads. No power, no box, no mount. A small note sat on top, said in pencil, 2 upstairs. Years passed, I learned HVAC for work. Saw a lot of bad ducts. I saw poor seals. I saw return leaks that pulled air from crawl spaces and basements. I saw dead things in plenums. Saw handprints and dust under registers. I told myself that old house was like that. Told myself the voice was wind through a cheap grill. Last year, a service call sent me back to that end of town. The gray house now looked white. New roof, new porch, new fence. I almost drove on. Then I parked and walked to the door to offer a tune-up. A boy answered. He stood with a cat in his arms. He looked past me down the hall. He said, "Can you stop the fan?" I told him I could. He whispered, "It speaks my name." I looked over his shoulder. The hall closet door stood bare. No dresser, no nails. A fresh hatch sat on clean hinges. The cat stared at it and hissed. I told the boy I could come back with a crew. I left. The heater in my van blew warm air on my face. It smelled like damp dirt. The summer I turned 14, my mom got a job at the town library. The building had a tall clock tower with iron stairs. The tower was off limits. A chain looped through the gate. A sign said staff only. The clock had stopped long ago. The hands read 3:17. People used it as a joke. "You're late," they said, by 10 years. I shelved books. I wiped tables. I learned the stacks by section codes. 398.24 folktales. 796 for sports. I learned the smell of dust and old glue. I liked the cool air and the hush. On a hot day in July, the AC failed. Miss Kell, the head librarian, sent me to plug in box fans. She gave me the key ring with tags. She said, "Stay out of the tower." She said it without a smile. At noon, I carried a fan to the top floor. The tower door stood near the study rooms. It was steel with a small wired glass window. The chain lay loose on the floor. The sign leaned against the wall. I stared at the door. I did not touch it. I listened. I heard a soft scrape, like a shoe on metal. I heard one footstep, then a pause, then another. The sound rose, step by step, in slow, even beats. The tower held a narrow stair. People said the smith had forged it by hand. The treads were open steel with a diamond pattern. You could see through to the bottom. You could lose a wrench in that spin and never hear it hit ground. I set the fan near the door and balanced the keyring on my palm. The scrape came again. One step, then a second, then a third. My mouth went dry. I stood very still. The sound stopped 1 floor below the door. I could picture a shadow on the landing. "Low," I said. Wind pressed through the wired glass and warmed my face. No one answered. The top clock face threw pale light on the corridor. The hand sat at 3:17. The minute hand cut the 3 and the 4. The hour hand lay near the 3. I went back down to the desk. I handed the keys to Ms. Kell. I asked who used the tower. She said no one. She said the last repair had failed. The clock stalled and the motor burned. She told me to leave it alone. She did not look up from her log. That night, I dreamed about the stairs. In the dream, something climbed with a limp. It held a grease can, touched each tread with a palm, and left a mark. It came to the door and put that palm on the wired glass. It left a print with lines like a map. A week passed. The AC returned. I kept to the main floors. But I now heard the steps every day at 3:17. One step. Pause. One step. Pause. I tried to count. The count matched the treads on the plan posted in the office. 126. On a storm day, the main lights flickered. The exit signs glowed. Ms. Kell told me to sweep the top floor and close early. I climbed past the tower door. The chain hung loose again. The wired glass had smudges. My stomach turned. I told myself it was oil from hands. I swept. I watched the minute hand crawl toward 3:17. At 3:16 the power blinked. The hallway fell dim. Only the rain made sound. Then the first step scraped the stair, and the second. I climbed. The rain tapped the clock face. My broom shook in my hands. I set the broom down and walked to the tower. I pressed my eye to the wired glass. The landing below lay empty. I could not see the next curve. The next step came. The echo slapped the metal like a slow drum. The sound carried across my skin. I slid the chain through the brackets. I pushed the padlock shut. I stood back. The steps did not stop. They came to the platform right behind the door. My heart beat hard in my neck. I pressed my hand to the glass. The cold ran into my palm. On the other side, something pressed back. It's not hard, not a strike. A flat hand, warm and human, met mine through the glass. Lines crossed the skin like a net. Scar cut through the center. My breath fogged the pain. The other side fogged too. I could not see its face. The hand slid down and rested on the lower pane. Then fingers tapped in a rhythm. 3 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 7 taps. Pause. Then 1. 3:17. The same mark as the clock. The hand lifted. The steps turned. They went down and down and down. They did not rush. The sound faded into the throat of the tower. I wanted to run. I felt like a mouse under a hawk. I turned and saw Ms. Kell at the end of the hall. She stood with a flashlight. The beam shook in her hand. She saw my face, and she knew. She said, "Did you lock it?" I nodded. She said, "Keep it that way." Her mouth looked tight and gray. The next day I came in early. I wanted a reason. I went to the map case. I rolled a sheet back. I found a thin folder with blue lines. Showed the tower when it was new. A name sat at the bottom. Culver and Sons Clock writes, a note said a man had fallen during the final tune. He died on the 9th landing when his heel caught in a bolt hole. He struck the rail and went over. The clock stopped that hour. The town held a small service. They did not bring him down. The plan said interminate sight. My hand shook. I put the map away. That afternoon, I saw a crow sit on the sill. It stared at me with a dark eye. It pecked the glass near the minute hand. The hands did not move. I told no one else. I worked the rest of that summer and kept my head down. On my last day, I climbed to the tower door at noon. I pressed my palm to the wired glass. It felt warm. I tapped the pane. 3, 1, 7. I waited. The steps began below my feet. 1 step. Pause. 1 step. Pause. They climbed to the landing. A hand rose and lay over mine. A slow pulse beat through the glass, and the hand tapped back. 3, 1, 7. The steps turned. They went down. The clock face brightened with a stray sunbeam. The hand still read 3:17. Years passed. The library got a grant. They fixed the clock. It now marks time right. The bell rings on the hour. I drove by last fall at 3:17. The bell rang once. The hands moved past the marks. Still, when the wind turns from the west, I hear iron ring in my head. I feel heat in my palm. I keep my hand off old glass. I took the night shift at the water plant when I was 24. The pay was steady. The work was to watch screens and walk rounds. SCADA showed flows and levels. Alarms flashed when a pump tripped or a gate stuck. I liked the hum of motors and the smell of chlorine. I liked the quiet. The plant sat by the river. Intake screens dipped in the current. A long pipe ran to raw basins. Clarifiers turned under a soft light. UV racks buzzed like bees. Do, 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 toes. Control room had 2 chairs, a coffee maker, and 10 monitors. 4 showed cameras. 2 showed trends. One sat dead and gray with a cracked panel. The old guys called it the ghost. On my 3rd week, I sat with a cup and a stale donut at 2 in the morning. Rain pushed across the river. The intake camera showed a dark roll of water. I leaned forward. A shape hung on the screen. It looked like a coat snagged on the bar rack. I called the gate phone and asked Mike to check the rake. Said the rake arm sat stuck from a fuse. He said he would reset. I watched the feed. The rake did not move. I put on boots and a vest and walked across the catwalk. The river hissed. The intake pit stank of fish and mud. I leaned over the rail and shined my light. The beam hit the bars. It hit a tangle of sticks. It hit a dark fold of cloth. I thought it was a tarp. Then the cloth turned and showed a face. I fell back and hit the rail. The face lifted and opened a mouth. Water poured out like a drain. Eyes looked past me as if I were a post. The rake moved with a bang. The arm scraped down the bars and pushed the tangle clear. The cloth tore free. The face slid down and out of sight. I ran to the control room and slammed the door. I watched the intake feed. The black water rolled. The tangle did not come back. I logged a snag and a heavy load. I did not log a face. At 3, an alarm flashed. Low level in clarifier 2. I pulled up the overview. The tank still showed a normal trend. The level sensor must have glitched. I silenced the horn. A new alarm hit. Motion in the service tunnel. Camera 7 woke up. The service tunnel ran under the basins. Pipes crossed above head height. The floor held a shallow drain. Camera sat at the midpoint by a sump. The screen showed mist. A human shape stood at the far end. Water dripped off its clothes and pattered on the floor. The figure turned and faced the lens. It looked like a crewman in a hood with a headlamp. The lamp did not throw light. The hood hung flat and black. I picked up the radio. Mike, you in the tunnel? Static. Mike, radio check. Static. I tried the phone. Ring, ring. No answer. I stood and grabbed my keys, clipped my badge to my collar. I took the big mag light and went down the stairs. The door to the tunnel had a push bar. I opened it and a wet smell hit me, like old basements and algae. My light cut down the hall. The floor shone. My boot prints showed behind me. I walked to the sump, where camera 7 sat in a cage. I looked through. The far end held nothing. No man. No drip. I heard steps behind me. I turned. No one there. I heard breath near my ear. Not close. Not a warm breath. A sound. Someone pulled air through a clogged pipe. A long inhale that did not end. The drain coughed and belched up a ribbon of weeds. My light shook in my hand. I backed to the door and pushed out into the stairwell. In the control room, I checked cameras again. The tunnel feed showed dry concrete. The intake feed showed a swirl of foam. I picked up the phone to call the on-call boss. The line clicked dead. The power to the phone rack cycled and came back. The dead monitor woke to a gray field. Text crawled across the glass. It spelled my name. The font looked like a printer test. A line of block letters crept and smeared and then held. My name in full. The hair on my arm stood up. The radio snapped and Mike's voice came through. Gate is clear, he said. Got hung on a coat. It's B from upstream, he coughed. Meet me by the lab, he said. Bring a towel. I met him by the door. He stood in a puddle. He dripped on the mat. His clothes stuck to his skin. He held a hard hat at his side. He smiled with closed lips and did not meet my eyes. I handed him a towel. He took it and did not use it. He walked past me toward the tunnel stairs. Not that way, I said. Use the locker room. He stopped and faced me. His eyes looked black under the light. He opened his mouth. Water spilled out. Not a little spit, a cup at least. It hit the concrete and ran toward the drain. He shut his lips and smiled. Ow. Then he walked down the stairs to the tunnel door. He did not touch the push bar. The door swung open. He stepped through and it shut behind him. I ran back to the control room and hit the PA. Mike, copy. No answer. I called the on-call boss. The line held this time. He told me to sit tight. He told me to check cameras and lock the gate. I locked the gate. At dawn, the day crew rolled in. The boss took one look at me and said, "Go home." He said we would talk at noon. I went home and showered. The water from the tap smelled like the river. I stood with my face to the tile and thought about a mouthful of water. The drain gurgled. At noon, I went back. Mike met me by the coffee maker. He looked fine. Dry jeans, dry boots. He laughed when I told him about the puddle. He held up his radio and said it died at 2. He said he went home early with a bad gut. He did not come back until 7. He turned his pockets out to show me a dry towel. It smelled like soap. We walked the tunnel. The floor held a long line of wet prints that started at the door. They ran to the sump and stopped. The prints did not look like boot treads. It looked like bare feet with webbed toes. I wanted to say they looked like hands. I did not say it. I worked there 6 more months. I never saw the face again. I never saw the webbed prints. Still, the dead monitor sometimes woke at 2 and wrote my name in block letters. It would smear and blur and then clear. I kept my radio on the whole time. I spoke my checks out loud. I did not walk near the sump. I moved to day shift in spring. The plant still stands. The water still runs. When I fill a glass at night, I watch for a line of weed in the stream. I watch for a small swirl that points at me. I drink fast. Put the glass in the sink. I do not look in the drain. I was 13 when Coach asked me to help lock up the gym. I liked the work. I flipped breakers. I stacked cones. I pushed the auto button to retract the bleachers. The motor groaned and the seats slid back into the wall. I watched the rails fold and latch. The gym had old lights with heavy ballasts. They took time to warm. They hummed and flicked. A scoreboard hung from the rafters. The control box sat in a cage. The key stayed with Coach. On a Friday in fall, the team left for an away game. Coach asked me to close the gym and leave the key on his desk. He pointed at the breaker box and said, "Lights first, bleachers last." He wanted me safe. Did not want me near moving parts after dark. I swept the floor, found a penny and a bent nail. I pocketed both, turned off the outer rows of lights. One bank stayed on. I pressed the button for the bleachers. The motor started, and the rows rolled toward the wall. Dust rose from under the steps. The smell reminded me of chalk and socks. The last row hit the latch. The red flag fell in place. I turned off the last bank and went to the hall. I heard a long drag across wood. I turned. The bleachers rolled out 3 feet. The red flag had slipped. The motor did not run. No hum. The row had moved. I walked back and pushed the face with my hands. The whole set rolled with a click and a shudder. It stopped when the flag caught. I pulled the pin and reset it. I ran the motor for 1 second. It pulled tight. I turned and left again. In the hall, the exit sign lit the trophy case. I took 3 steps. The gym door swung behind me and hit the stop. The sound bounced off the tile. Could not breathe for a second. I walked back. The bleachers stood half out again. The red flag lay on the floor. I picked it up. The clip was not broken. The pin had been pulled. I looked under the seats. Space was darkened and close. Steel crossbars ran shoulder height. I crawled in and shined my phone light. The motor mount shone clean. The roller chains looked greased. I saw a mark on the dust on the slab, not a shoe, not a rat, for long lines with a small curve at the end of each, like fingers. I backed out and stood. The scoreboard came to life. The buzzer bleated. All zeros glowed red. The control box hung in the cage with no key in the lock. The cord ran to the outlet. Switch sat off. The buzzer faded. The clock ticked down from 10 o'clock on its own. I called Coach. No answer. I texted him and got a back. He was on the bus. I put my phone in my pocket and walked to the breaker box. I flipped the main for the gym. The lights died. Scoreboard stayed lit. The clock kept counting. Under the bleachers, I heard a short cough, like someone tried to clear dust from a throat. The cough turned into a chant. Not words. A rhythm. 4 beats in, 2 beats out. Bleacher rails knocked in time. It's metal on metal. I felt the beat in my chest. The last row slid another inch. I took a deep breath and crawled under again. My light shook. I moved past one crossbar, then another. The space narrowed. I reached the motor. The motor stood still. The chain did not move. The rail by my ear shifted on its own. The gap between rows pressed toward my head. I could not turn around. I had to back out. I pushed with my toes. The rows groaned. The gap closed to the width of my hand. I drove my feet into the floor and shoved. The bleachers gave a half-inch. I slid my head back. The seat above scraped my hair. I tore my shirt. I hacked and kicked and slid. A set of cold fingers ran across the back of my neck. 5 tips pressed to my skin. I yelled and shoved and rolled into the open floor. I lay there on my back and gasped. I stared up at the rafters. Dust drifted. The scoreboard hit 0 o'clock and the horn screamed. It cut through my bones. I crawled to the breaker and killed the whole wing. The horn stopped. The gym went black. I stood in the dark and listened to my heart. I used the exit light to find the door. I left the key on Coach's desk. I went home and did not sleep. In the morning, I told him what I saw. He looked tired, said he would have the district electrician check the system. He patted my shoulder, did not meet my eyes. On Monday, the electrician came. He wore a belt with a meter and a punch-down tool. He checked the panel, checked the outlets. He checked the scoreboard cable. He said the ground was bad. He drove a new rod and tightened a lug. He said the bleachers were fine. He said a latch can slip. He said to add a second pin. That night I watched practice. I sat on the bottom row. The row felt warm through my jeans. I put my palm on the wood. A soft tap came from inside the wall, then a second, then a third. It sounded like someone under there drummed with knuckles. The player beside me swore and jumped up. He rubbed his thigh and said something pinched him. No one else heard the taps. They ran drills and laughed, and the season went on. No one got hurt by the seats. The buzzer did not scream on its own again. But when I closed the gym, I felt breath on my neck. A touch. 5 tips that found the same place on my skin each time. The old janitor said a student got pinned once when the motor failed. He lay there under the stack for a long time. He lived. He walked fine. He moved away. The janitor kept his name off his tongue. He pointed at the rails and said, "Always lock out. Always tag out." He lifted a little brass tag on a chain. He held it up like a medal. I bought my own lock and tag with my money. I clipped it on the box. I kept the key around my neck. Long after I left that school, I went back for a league game. I sat near midcourt. The horn sounded clean. The rows looked safe. The bleacher face had fresh paint. The kid walked past me with popcorn. He rubbed the back of his neck and frowned. He looked at his hand. When I was 8, my dad drove a snowplow for the county. In spring, he drove a dump truck and fixed potholes.
In summer, he flagged for road work. Our house sat near the old highway with long straight runs and farm fields.
I learned every mile marker, counted them on bike rides. I liked the green signs, 38, 39, 41. At mile 41, the land dropped, and the road rose on a fill. A creek ran under through a big round culvert. A cattle guard sat on the side road. In the wet month's fog, lay over the ditch like a white sheet. The county kept a cone there to mark the soft shoulder. A man used to stand by that cone. He wore an orange vest and a hard hat. He held a stop, slow paddle at his side. He waved at me when I rode past. I waved back. He never crossed into the lane. He never stepped on the strip. He said, "How's the bike?" in a flat voice. I said, "Good." He smiled and watched the field. I asked my dad if the crew worked out there. He said no. He said the road was fine. He said mile 41 was the easy part. He said the crew took their breaks at the gravel pit. One day I biked to the guard and the man was gone. The cone lay on its side. The paddle leaned against the post. I picked it up. The sign felt heavy. The slow side had a dull smear like a hand had rubbed it. The stop side had a crack through the O. I set it back and went home. That night, rain hit hard. The house creaked. I woke to the beep of a truck in reverse. It sounded like it sat on our road. I pushed my blinds and looked. No truck. The sound came again. Then I heard a whistle. One long blow like a foreman used to start a shift. My dad's room door opened. Stood in the hall with his hair up and his face blank. He listened. He said, "Hear that?" I nodded. He picked up his jacket and walked to the porch. Looked out at the highway. He said, "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and a chain. I watched him from the window. He crossed the yard and stepped onto the shoulder. He turned his light toward mile 41. The beam showed rain and the cone on its side. The beam showed a shadow like a man near the culvert. The shadow raised an arm and swung a paddle. My skin went cold. My dad put his hands to his mouth and yelled, "You all right?" His voice broke like it had hit a wall. He walked toward the sign. Then he stopped. He turned and marched back to the house, shut the door. He locked it. He leaned his back on the wood, said we do not go there at night. In the morning, I asked him what he saw. He drank coffee and looked at the floor. He said a flagger died out there on a fog day after a bridge job. A car flew the crown and hit the sign and dragged the man into the ditch. He said the crew put a cross there for a year. He said a tractor crushed it in a harvest. Said the county pulled the rest. Said that was before I was born. I went to school and told my friend Chris. He said ghosts loved water. Said the culvert made a tunnel. He said the man lived in there now. Said we should go at night and say his name. I said no. Summer came. The road steamed after sun went down. The creek smelled like iron and moss. I rode at dusk out to mile 41. The cone stood upright. The paddle lay in the weeds. I got off my bike and picked it up. Sign had dried mud on the edge. I wiped it with my sleeve. The stop side had a streak like a hand had tried to grip it. The wood shaft had deep dents from teeth or nails. I held it and faced the lane. I flipped too slow and lifted my arm. I said, "You can pass," to no one. Fog rose from the ditch and rolled to the edge of the asphalt. A whisper rode up from the culvert. I thought it was the creek. It shaped a word. Clear, the word came again. Clear, my arm shook. I set the paddle by the post and got on my bike. I rode home without looking back. For a while nothing happened. Then I woke one night to the sound of a two-way radio in the hall. Static popped. A voice said, "Hold." Then clear. Then hold in a voice I knew from the ditch. I stood and looked out my door. Green light filled the hall like the glow of those mile signs. My dad stood in the light with his eyes shut. He held one arm up at a right angle like a flagger. He brought it down. He brought it up. He breathed in a square pattern. I called to him. He did not answer. He brought his arm down and said, "Clear." Then he woke and looked at me with his mouth open. He saw the green light and swore. The light went out. The hall was dark. He would not talk about it with me. He said shift work got in his head. He said that was all. He set a rule. No biking past 40 after dusk. I broke the rule once. I went out at sunset. At mile 41, the cone lay on its side again. I set it upright. I looked under the lip and saw black skid marks. They formed an X right over the culvert. They ran to the ditch. The mud there had a smooth dent, shaped like a head had pressed hard and then lifted. I left for college at 18. My parents sold the house in my sophomore year. I took a bus home for a visit and asked the driver to let me off by the old road. I walked to mile 41 in rain. Fog lay over the ditch. The cone stood upright. The paddle was gone. New guardrails lined the curve. I stood there and listened to the water. Cars shot by and threw spray on my shoes. A beat-up pickup pulled into the shoulder and stopped. The driver leaned across and pushed the window down. He wore an orange vest and no hat. His hair lay flat from rain. He held a paddle across the seat, smiled like a man who has stood a long time with no one to talk to. He said, "You folks slow down when you see a sign." I nodded. He set the paddle on the dash and opened his door. He stepped out and stood in the lane. He raised the stop side. Cars shrieked their brakes and stopped. He waved them through one by one with a careful hand. He did not look my way again. I walked back to the bus stop with my head down. When the bus came, I looked back through the fogged glass. No truck on the shoulder, no man in the road. The cone lay on its side. The new guardrail gleamed. The mile sign read 41. The creek ran. The white sheet of fog covered the ditch like a blanket pulled up to a chin. I have a job that takes me past other markers now. 12, 19, 24. I still count them when I drive. I look for cones at dusk. I slow down when I see a shine in the road. I do it for the living, and I do it for the dead. When rain hits and green light spills through the cab from a reflective sign, I feel my arm rise. I hold it at a right angle. I drop it. I whisper, "Clear." Then I keep both hands on the wheel. I keep my eyes on the lane. I do not stop. I do not cross the fog.